State College is the home of the Pennsylvania State College, which is now called the Pennsylvania State University. And at the time I was attending the college, it was an enrollment of about 6,000, and that was about the population of the town. And I took the chemistry course with the School of Chemistry and Physics. The mentor at that time was Frank Whitmore. He actually picked up 3 of us and treated us like graduate students. We were all named Robert, so it was the 3 Bobs. We graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry. And then I got a teaching fellowship at the University of Illinois. At that time, the most prestigious university for organic chemistry. And I was going to work for Speed Marvel, who was a polymer man. But in the meantime, I got a summer job at Eastman Kodak in Rochester. That was the first summer at a company, and I actually went the second summer, although Kodak didn't expect me. But I ended up at the research lab at both times. So I had some pretty good connections with Kodak. And the personnel man at Kodak that I'd gotten to know through the summer jobs located me, despite the fact that I was in a little shoebox apartment without a telephone. And he said he was sending me a job offer at Tennessee Eastman, and he wanted me to be sure to take it or at least go on an interview trip. It was in a small town in the mountains, and I didn't like any of the other job offers I had because they were in big cities, or they were on the East Coast, or they were up north. And so I just blindly took the job at Tennessee Eastman with a new PhD that I got without even putting a robe on. The wartime situations were different than having really fancy graduations. So in the February of '43, I came to Kingsport. In the summer of '42, which I missed by coming here in February of '43, was the time when Tennessee Eastman, without even a letter of intent from the government, decided to make explosives. And the reason for that was that they were using a process that required the use of acetic anhydride. And that was what Eastman was. You know, that's the lifeblood of Eastman. So the strange thing about it was that there was a process for making RDX, the explosive, that was invented by a fellow named Bob Schiessler, who was a very close buddy of me at Penn State. We had the same courses, and he got a job at Kodak for one summer as well as I did. But Bob Schiessler went to McGill, who was already in, Canada was already in the war. And he and a fellow named Ross came up with a way to make RDX from formaldehyde, ammonium nitrate, but the medium that they used was acetic anhydride. And a Michigan professor took that process and changed it by having the ammonia and the formaldehyde put together first, and then treated with straight nitric acid in acetic anhydride. So between the amount of anhydride that Tennessee Eastman used for making cellulose acetate and other things, and the explosives plant that was put together, almost a quarter of the world's supply of acetic anhydride was made here right in Kingsport. After the war, Kodak changed their policy. They decided to put all of the chemistry. Kodak was about 20% chemistry and 80% photography. They decided to put all the chemistry in Kingsport. And so they appointed a man named Jim McNally, who had been an assistant works manager at the Oak Ridge Project. And he came in as our director of research, commissioned to take this small laboratory and make a decent research organization out of it. In 15 years, he built it up to a first-class research organization of some 600 people. And I was there long ago for the ride. He picked me up and told me he wanted a high-pressure lab put together. I told him I didn't have any background in that and wasn't an engineer. He poo-pooed both of my objections, and I realized when this man says do it, you mean it. Do it. So I spent 14 years designing, getting a high-pressure lab built, and operating it. McNally also told me when we got things started that anybody who wanted work done in high pressure had to do it in my laboratory. So we actually got so much work to do that we had to go to 5 days a week, 24 hours a day. In my hydrogenation work, I came up with the glycol that was used to make Eastman's first polyester. The program at one time it was called S50. It was at an advanced stage. People were running around wearing S50 suits, actually testing them out. But the yarn plant research group didn't like them. They didn't like that fiber. And when my first hydrogenation attempt came up with a material called CHDM, McNally, in the middle of this project, an overnight decision, he abandoned the advanced S50 program and went with what we call T16. And that became the fiber called Kodel, the first product that Kodak ever allowed to use the KOD as a nameplate for it. It was very, very strange that they actually allowed Eastman to market T16 as Kodel. It was a premium polyester for carpets. It made big plush carpets that didn't cow track. They always bounced back. It didn't make a path that most polyesters did. Well, I eventually had so much chemistry going in the laboratory that I passed on the jurisdiction of the high-pressure laboratory. And then the next thing I knew, McNally told me he wanted me to go to Switzerland because they had a laboratory over there that called Eastman Research AG, meaning in German, stock company. At the end of 3 years, I was back in Kingsport as the division head of the chemistry group. I decided that I needed to work in the field of what we call ketenes. Ketene is made by cracking acetic acid. Crack a water molecule out of acetic acid, you get a material called ketene. And I told my buddy Ed Elam in the lab that we were so entranced with the idea that you made acetic anhydride by combining ketene and acetic acid, that we didn't know that you could take it apart and get a supply of ketene. So Ed put together a cracker, and he told me it worked just fine. You get 100% ketene, and we had our material. It turns out, though, the ketene is a very uninteresting material. It's good for making acetic anhydride and practically nothing else. And I said to Ed, you need to try isobutyric anhydride. And he gave me a look that indicated he didn't think much of the idea. But in a year, he got around to actually cracking isobutyric anhydride. And he came in one day and he says, believe it or not, I have a pot full of dimethylketene. Well, dimethylketene is much, much different than ketene. It reacts with everything. And we had a ball. Everybody in the laboratory was playing with the dimethylketene. And I started writing papers. And they made enough of an impact when we published them that I got nominated to be a fellow of the prestigious Society for American Association for Advancement of Science. I am now a fellow of that organization. There are lots of things about Kingsport that really surprised me when I came here without even coming on an interview trip. For example, on the church circle, there were 2 Methodist churches. Well, I married a minister's daughter, and I was well acquainted with the fact that the 3 major Methodist churches all got together in 1939. What was it doing? It was still having 2 separate churches here, one in the north and one in the south. Well, we actually joined Broad Street, which was the former Southern Church. We actually ran into a leading layman who ran a furniture store, and we were, of course, looking for furniture for our living quarters. Well, I've had every job there is in Broad Street, including the chairman of the board. I've taught Sunday school. I've had a whole career in that. I was on the union committee when we decided to, absorb the other church. And I was chairman of the naming committee. What are we going to call this new church? I wanted to call it the first church, because the circle had the First Baptist, the First Presbyterian, Broad Street, and First Church. I thought if we abandon the name Broad Street and use First Church, they won't feel like they've been gobbled up by the bigger Broad Street, and it'd be very consistent with the rest of the churches on the circle. Well, when I bounced that off of some of the leading laymen, they told me that the name Broad Street would be abandoned over their dead body. So that was that. I also been very interested in Kingsport's library. I was on the library commission at one time, at the time when the digital techniques were used. I remember the Junior League put together the Friends of the Library, and they came to me and asked me to be president. So I was president of the Friends for the first 2 years of their existence. A mayor came along in Kingsport who didn't think that anybody should be on the library commission who wasn't a citizen of Kingsport. And I was living in Crown Colony at the time, which was not in the city. So I got fired. But I've had a lot of fun with organizations in Kingsport. This is I just look back on it and wonder, why was I lucky enough to just decide to come here, despite the fact that if I had come on an interview trip, I probably wouldn't have taken the job, because the research lab was such a piddly little group that didn't know what they were doing. But I was here for the ride when the McNally years came along, and in 15 years, that little tiny group graduated into a major company.